two deeply unquestioned assumptions in science, never questioned. The first is that matter is insentient, that matter doesn't have any awareness whatsoever. That's where things get stuck. That's where the hard problem comes from. We assume that matter has no consciousness whatsoever. And so the problem comes, how does consciousness come into existence then? Well, and here the twist is, the matter that we assume is unconscious is the model of matter which we have in the mind. We don't know what the physical world itself is like. We have this image in the mind of matter, and that's all we ever know. We think that image we have of matter is unconscious. And that's where I think all the problems come from.
In Judeo-Christian thinking, there's the instant of Genesis, when God said, "Let there be light." But in Buddhism, there is no Genesis. Timelessness, no beginning, no end. And how can you reconcile this? Either the universe had a beginning or it didn't. There's no middle ground until now. Now there is a way to combine Buddhism with Judeo-Christian thinking on Genesis. We physicists now believe, though we can't yet prove yet, we believe that there is continual Genesis in an ocean, a timeless ocean of 11-dimensional nirvana.
I'm Dr. Mitchell Gibson. I'm a psychiatrist by profession, but I'm going to retire from that in about a month so I can do teaching full time. And this is my passion, teaching people spirituality and the wonders of human potential. I see some faces from last year, and I see a lot of people that are new. This is a seminar. Actually, this is a talk that is condensed from a 2-day seminar. So we have 115 slides to get through. We won't get through all of them. But we have about 3 hours. I mean, there's going to be a break in there. What we're going to do today is to go over the forces and the dynamics of the spiritual world. And we're going to make some definitions about what the spiritual world is, how it functions, and how we function within it. Because as human beings, we are an integral part of what we would sort of loosely call the spiritual world. It is a real thing. Now, why is a doctor here talking to you about the spiritual world? Well, when I was a kid, and you probably heard this story 100 times, but it's true, I could see things around people, and I could see people that had passed on, and I thought everybody could do that. And so one day I talked with my pastor, who happened to be a fundamentalist Baptist minister, about that. I was 7, and I asked him, why do these dead people hang around their funerals? Why do these spirits walk around? And he told my mom. And I didn't mention it much after that, because I realized that most people couldn't see those things. When I was in the first grade, I would sit in my class while the teacher was going over certain things, and I would leave my body and float on the ceiling and look at her upside down. I thought it was funny until I told her about it one day. I've learned since not to talk so much, except in certain groups. I learned that certain things about humanity, most people can't really accept. Most people accept reality the way that we're taught. But reality doesn't necessarily conform itself to rules that we are readily taught in school. As Dr. Michio Kaku was talking about this morning, reality has multiple dimensions. That's been proven. And that those dimensions have a reality outside of our physical understanding. Well, today we're going to go into a fair amount of detail about what's known about that physical understanding of the spiritual world and how we can use it to help evolve ourselves. The spiritual world is somewhat different than what you might suspect. It's not just a world where ghosts or spirits walk around all day in white robes and kind of just chill and wait for their next life. It's a much more robust and, how shall I say, active place, dynamic place than the physical world. The physical world, in my own personal research and in my own reading and training, is a place that is derived from the spiritual world. So we're going to answer some basic questions at the beginning and set up the discussion or the presentation so that we have some clear definitions about what we're going to be talking about. First question is, what is the spiritual world? We're going to answer that shortly. How does it differ from the physical world? We're also going to answer that shortly. And an important question, which is not just for shamans or magicians or people who are in spirituality, how do you get there? What is the significance of talking about the spiritual world for everyday people? We're also going to start with a general theory, a theory you may or may not have heard in some detail in the past. Human beings in this theory, and it's a general theory of how we can meld the spiritual world and the physical world together. The theory is human beings descended from a primordial state of energy. Primordial means unformed or undescended into matter. The second condition of this theory is that the present condition of the human body is a transitional condition that is a complex of energy and matter. The human body is not the solid thing we think it is. Actually, one of the amazing things about particle physics is that we haven't discovered any solid particles yet. And that human beings, everything that we see is not solid. When we touch ourselves, when we touch a rock or sand or eat food, it feels solid. But that's a very convincing illusion. That's not real. Every atom we ever looked at can be split. And you keep splitting it, and it gets down to the point where it's just energy. And the human body is no exception to that. The human body, as a matter of fact, we're going to go over some remarkable slides, can be made to return to a state of pure energy while a person is still alive. And there's been some research to show that, and there's been a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people, that have done that consciously. This isn't just something that is a mathematical construct or mystical theoretical discussion. This is something that happens. This is something that happens on what you would almost call a regular basis. The vast majority of humanity in this general theory still exists in a state of energy, undescended into matter. And humans still exist in what we call, in the physical form, are only a small fraction of human beings. And that primordial humans are all around us. Now you might ask, well, I can't see them, I can't touch them. Well, you might ask the same question of bacteria. You can't see them, you can't touch them, but they outnumber humans billions to one. Primordial humans are the same. Their true home is the spiritual world, and that's the world we're going to be discussing. These primordial humans, humans that live in a different state than you and I, have a different energy density than we do. We might call them spirits. They also present themselves as luminous beings. I'm going to go over some discussion about what that is. They can take a variety of shapes and forms. Also, some of these primordial humans are a lot smarter than we are. They have greater intelligence and greater mastery over reality. Also, these primordial humans live in what physical humans call the spiritual world. So the interface between physical humans, us, and primordial humans, which are humans that are undescended into matter, is called the spiritual world. We're going to look at several clues as to why this theory was generated. And we're going to take clues from several areas. The first clue we're going to look at are clues from the ancient world. Now, a lot of people, when we were growing up, we thought that people a long time ago were very primitive. We thought that they didn't know anything compared to you and I. And actually, that's far from the truth. In many cases, primitive people, ancient people, are not primitive at all. They're a lot more intelligent, a lot more advanced than we are. Also, we have clues from the modern world. There is evidence from the modern world that the spiritual world and the human physical world are not that dissimilar, that there's an interface that we're just beginning to understand and to see. Also, we have clues from the world of science, which shows that the scientific model of reality in physics is showing that the world is not made of matter. The world is made of something entirely different than what we thought, which fits more into a mystical, sort of philosophical model of reality than what we had originally thought. Also, we can get clues from the world's great religions: spirituality, general spirituality, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, and Judaism. All the major religions talk about an energy matter interface between physical humans and spiritual or primordial humans that we can only begin just now to understand. Also, there is some pictorial evidence from photographs that we can point to. And also, there are ancient and modern spiritual practices that we can use, physical humans can use, to transform ourselves into something far beyond the physical state. Let's start with the ancient world. In the ancient world, Tibetan Buddhists taught that by looking at this letter, which is the Tibetan letter for A, is pronounced A, allowed humans to regain contact with the primordial form from which we are all descended. They teach that there's a primordial energy form that all humans are in the physical body descend from, and that the body can be contacted through a special meditation with this letter. Also in the ancient world, there are legends. Some of these legends are actually not legends, but true stories that have been handed down as recitations or oral teachings that talk about a number of ancient spiritual masters who have dissolved their physical bodies into pure energy. Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay. And most of these exercises are techniques that have to be applied over a series of years, though a few of them are instantaneous. But there are a number of these exercises that can be taught and are being taught in present modern day times that allow a person to be transformed back into energy and to go back and forth. The overall result of these exercises is to change the physical body into something that is not physical, something that is energetic. Let's talk about some names of particular people who have done this. There's a man an ancient master by the name of Jampil Shinyan, who lived in Bodhgaya, India, who transformed his body completely into light. This was about the 1500s. And there's another great master by the name of Sri Singha, who transformed his body near the cremation grounds of Celia in central China. And there was another one, Vimala Mitra, who transformed his body in Kashmir. And Janasutra transformed his body near the Basing cremation grounds in northern India. Now, they would perform this while they're still alive. So these teachings about these masters have actually been handed down for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so you might say that sounds like something that is a myth or a legend only, but there's more to support that. In the modern world, people disappear every day, just in the thin air. It's estimated that each year in the U.S. alone, over 10 million people just disappear. Now, you could obviously argue that over 95% of these might be accounted for by crime or people just wanting not to be found or abductions. But it's estimated in Newsweek magazine that over 800,000 of these people never come back. They're just not accounted for. And that not all of these disappearances can be explained so easily. So when you look at the numbers, let's say that even a fraction of this is true. Let's say that even 1,000 people disappear. There's something going on there that we can get some more clues about. In the year 1815, in a Prussian prison, there was a prisoner by the name of Durerci who was sentenced for assuming his employer's identity. He was sent to jail. And one afternoon, this prisoner was chained together with a number of other prisoners, and they were walking in the prison yard for exercise. And shackled together with other prisoners, this person just slowly began to fade into nothingness. This is a documented case, and disappeared in the middle of nowhere. His body became more and more transparent and disappeared altogether, so that only his manacles and leg irons were left. He was never seen again. And this was a documented case from the Anecdotal History of Missing Persons by J. Robert Nash. Not that this happens every day, but once in a while it does. Yes?
Did his clothes disappear too?
Everything disappeared but his manacles and leg irons. This is another case from the modern world about a man named James Warson in England. And this man was a shoemaker. And he made a bet with some friends, just to summarize this slide, that he could run 16 miles without stopping. Well, his friends were following him in a horse cart and just watching him. And they saw him as he was running fall forward. And he never hit the ground. His body just disappeared. Clothes, everything. He completely vanished. They got the police involved in the investigation. He never showed up anywhere. And this is from a fascinating book by the name of Into Thin Air, which documents a number of these cases of people going into another world that we don't fully yet understand, by Paul Begg. There was a British diplomat who was a high-level official in the British government that disappeared into thin air in front of people in 1809. He had stopped for dinner and stepped in front of his coach to examine his horses, and he simply disappeared without a trace. Just gone, for no reason. Now, this doesn't just happen to one person or one individual. I'm sure you all have heard of cases where entire villages or ships will disappear. And they have to be going somewhere. So we're going to talk about possibly where they're going. In November 1930, so this was a somewhat more recent case, in a village in northern Canada, a trapper by the name of Joe LaBelle went into a community of about 2,000 residents, and there was nobody there. There was still food that had been left. The dogs had been left, but the dogs had starved to death. And nobody ever found any of the people, no bodies, nothing. There was no traces in the snow or anything. It gets weirder. There's a story in 1915 during World War I where an entire battalion of soldiers was witnessed disappearing. And this was a famous case where 3 soldiers saw an entire battalion of English soldiers that marched and never came back out. The battalion was assumed to be kidnapped or taken prisoner by the Turkish government. Britain demanded that they be released. Nobody ever saw them again. Now, it's possible that this was a UFO. It's possible that it's something a little bit weirder. So, let's look at the world of science. In the world of science, science has now pretty much proven that 96% of the universe can't be seen. That when you look at a room like this, when you look up through a telescope, when you look up in the sky, that 96% of what's there, you can't see it. The best estimates of what the universe is made up of anyway, like Dr. Kaku said, is something called dark energy or dark matter. We can't see it, but it accounts for more than 96+% of the universe's matter. It's also the most common thing that is in existence. Dark matter is not made of protons, electrons, or neutrons. So when you look at your body, 96% of your body is not protons, electrons, and neutrons. Your body is an unstable matrix of something we're only beginning to understand. Well, oddly enough, the world's great religions have already anticipated this discovery. They say that there's something in the body, the physical body, that the physical body is moving toward. That the physical body is not just something that is going to live, be fed, and die one day, and that's it. That there's sort of a higher purpose for what we are as physical beings. In Christianity, they call that the resurrection body. In Hinduism, it's referred to as the Vajra body. In Buddhism, they call it the Buddha body. In Tibetan Buddhism, they call it the Jalus. And we'll refer to that a little bit later. And in Indonesian Islam, they call it the body of light. And in Islam in general, it's called the diamond body. But as you can see, in most of the world's greater religions or major religions, there's already an anticipation that something greater is in store for the human body rather than just death. And that the true home of the human body is not the physical world. That the physical world is only a temporary place that the human body lives on its way to somewhere else. Now let's look at some interesting cases here. This is a picture that a patient gave me. And this is a picture, if you look at it closely, shows a being that is floating above what looks like a mantle or something near the door. And this is a picture that was taken shortly after the death of a lady in the family. And this being stayed and talked with this family for 6 hours. The being said it was from another dimension that was made out of a different sort of matter, and it had come to collect the soul of the lady who had just died. I asked the family members not to turn this picture in, not to do anything with it, because I felt that they would get the wrong sort of publicity for it. And so they haven't. But if you look at this picture, you can see a being that looks like a butterfly. And it has, if you look at it closely, has a human head. The head, when you blow this up, has eyes, he has a mustache, he has blonde hair. And it's sort of weird because I'd never seen anything quite like that. So it points to, and these are very simple people. These are not people that would go around with very sophisticated technology to make something like this up. The lady that showed me this was in tears. She wanted to have some sort of explanation. This is another picture that was sent to me, and some of you might have seen this. This was taken during a transatlantic flight. And the plane went into difficulty, and the pilot announced that they were going to crash land because the plane had taken a nosedive. And one man on board decided to take a photograph. Now, the plane's crashing. He's got his camera out snapping pictures. Sort of an unusual presence of mind, I would say. And the plane suddenly just leveled off. And everybody was saved. When the man took the picture outside, he said that he saw something like an angel in the clouds. And the angel had extended his hand over the plane, and the plane was saved. And this photo was provided by a man from Holland who had witnessed this and had developed the picture. If you look at the picture, you can see something that looks like a man with a robe, and you can see sort of like a sash around the robe. And that's not something that you would expect during a plane crash. It was just something that was not planned in any way. It seems like there's another dimensional sort of energy going on there, another form of matter that's interacting with our physical matter in a way that we can't account for with our physical laws. This is another picture. I specialize in forensic psychiatry, which is the type of psychiatry that deals with accidents, injury, and illness that don't lead to death. When it leads to death, it's called forensic pathology. Now, this is a picture from a car accident. If you look at that car, you would think that nobody would walk away from that. But the occupant said that they saw a being floating in front of the car before the accident, and they walked away both without a scratch. Now, this picture was taken by a police photographer who said that he also saw this. Again, you see an energetic sort of being, a being that is not physical, obviously, but obviously there's a form of matter there that we're not fully able to explain with our physical laws. There's something else going on there. Now, everybody has heard of luminous balls of light or orbs. This is a picture that was taken, I think it was about 5 years ago, above a cemetery. And this person that took the picture saw these luminous balls of light. There's a very famous author by the name of Brad Steiger who took a survey of over 20,000 people. And in his survey, he talked to people who believed they had experienced something supernatural. 37% believed that they had experienced a light being, and 38% that believed that they had experienced an angel. Millions of people have taken pictures of these luminous balls. So let's talk about what this might be. This is another picture taken in someone's backyard of these luminous balls, and this person actually saw them. When you look at these balls, you see sort of a matter or cell-like structure inside of it. And you see them just floating around the background in there. This is another picture, and you see the balls in different colors and different shapes and different sizes. And literally millions of people have taken pictures like this. And people really don't understand what that is. So the question comes up, according to the theory, is this a picture of a different type of human being? This is a picture of primordial humans undescended into matter. Is this a picture of a different state of matter that we don't fully understand? This is another picture taken, again, near a cemetery and in a backyard, and literally billions of these things have been photographed. And the first thing you would think, well, these people have dirty cameras. There's something wrong with these cameras, but not all of them can be accounted for like that. So let's talk about some physical modern techniques that might begin to explain why all of these different forms of matter, these pictures, these beings that look like angels, these luminous balls of light, let's try to make some sense out of what this might be by looking at one particular technique and one particular case, which will lead us directly into a discussion about the spiritual world. The rainbow body, or the jalous, can be generated by something called the Tricode practice. The Tricode practice is a specific form of Tibetan Buddhism where one's physical body is dissolved intentionally into the subatomic constituents that make up the body, leaving only the hair and nails behind. Has anybody heard of this before?
That's Chagall. It's not Trek
Okay. Actually, it is. Say that again?
I thought it was Chagall, not Trek Show. Trek Show, you don't gain the rainbow body.
Actually,
It's
this is
Chagall,
correct.
I thought.
Okay. The process generally takes about 7 days where the body progressively shrinks in size. And there's a very famous modern case where this happened. This is a man by the name of Khenpo Achos, who died in the summer of 1998, which is actually relatively recently. And he died without any signs of old age or illness. After extensive training in, never been sure how to pronounce that word. Does anybody know? Nyingma. And this word? Gelug. Okay. These are schools of Tibetan Buddhism, and he was known for teaching the toughest bandits in that community these forms of Buddhism. He had lived almost a monastic form of life, and he retreated into a small village and began to practice mantras and visualizations. And people began to say that he would generate light and energy and perform miracles in his area. About a year before he died, a Rinpoche advised him to have a thangka painted of Ganden. Has anybody heard of the Ganden before? Ganden is one of the heavens in Tibetan Buddhism, where a person lives immediately around the time where they become a Buddha or a Maitreya, which is a form of world savior. So it's it's called the heaven of contentment. Khenpo began to change right before the time that he died. The week before he died, a rainbow appeared over his house. And this was documented by a Stanford professor who was also a priest, Brother Francis Tissot. And this was documented and written up in a number of journals. I think the most common one was the International Institute of Subtle Energy and also the Journal for Gnosis. Francis Tissot, Brother Tissot, said that he saw the wrinkles on this man's skin disappear and that his skin became like that of a very young boy. Another of his disciples said that his skin actually became luminous, but Brother Francis said that he actually saw the skin release light. Everyone present noticed a sort of sweet fragrance and that they saw rainbows fill the sky. They also heard something that sounded like music, but they couldn't make out the words in the area that this man was passing. A Lama, after his passing, his immediate passing, a Lama told Khenpo's disciples to cover his body with a yellow cloth and not to touch it. The disciples could see through the cloth and they saw that his body was shrinking. But there was no sign of any decomposition, no insects, no smell, and the weather was warm outside. On the 8th day, they looked in the box that they had stored his body, and there was no body at all. His body had completely vanished. All they found was his clothing, actually the cloth, and there were no marks on his clothing at all. And they found something else. This was all that remained of his body. And it's one of the reasons they call it the rainbow body. One of the things that happened to the Buddha when he passed is that they had difficulty cremating his body. And they say that many of the relics that were left as a result of Buddha transforming. This man, Kinpo, said that he had distilled his body down to the direct essence of what his body was made of, as a direct result of the practice that he had talked about. Well, when you look into this phenomena, which was somewhat fascinating to me, you find that he's not alone, that this is something that happens fairly frequently. This is an area of Tibet called the Sacred Dzogchen Natural Mountain Caves area. And this is about 7,000 meters up, which is over 20,000 feet, pretty high up in the area. And this is an area where many of the world's practitioners, or the most enlightened practitioners, go to achieve enlightenment, but not only to look for enlightenment. They also go to particular caves, this one particularly. And in this particular cave, in the Wright Canyon area, there have been many yogis in the Dzogchen tradition who transform their bodies directly from this cave into light or into energy. This is called the solitary retreat practice, and they say that it is the fastest way to achieve enlightenment in one single lifetime. It costs $25 a month to maintain this cave, and in 1959 the Tibetan government went to great lengths to destroy most of these, which I thought was a shame. Now, this lineage is something that has been going on for quite some time. This has been going on for a number of years. The Holy Dzogchen area is a natural sacred land, and there have been many supernatural beings who still appear here on a regular basis. It's a place of great pilgrimage in the Far East. And many of the practitioners who go here experience the Buddha, they experience a number of bodhisattvas, they still experience a number of beings who have enlightened and moved on to this spiritual world dimension. And they call it a place of miracles. They say that this particular area, which is between the Siltram Snow Mountains and the Rudam Canyon, is a place where many miracles still occur every day. So it's a place of great pilgrimage that most Americans don't know about. So in modern times, there have actually been a number of other people who have done this transformation that is not well written about in our country. Another person went to the Holy Dzogchen area and met Vimalamatra, who was one of the masters who had died, who had transformed himself into a body of light hundreds of years before. He meditated after receiving this special energy from this being Vimalamatra. And in 1958, he was taken to prison by the Chinese army. As he was being taken to prison, and this is a very famous case, he began to fly into the air and disappeared in front of everybody's view. And he transformed into light in front of the Chinese army. In another very similar case, this is another man, Sonam Namgyal, who is probably one of the most famous cases, was also practicing the Dzogchen tradition and attained the rainbow body in front of thousands of people, just in front of people who were watching him do this. He did it in particular in public. And to date, more than 100,000 people have transformed themselves using this technique and this tradition into what we call a rainbow body. These people in this tradition have changed themselves from physical matter purposely into a different form, which is something that in our Western mind doesn't really sound possible. This is a man who is a very interesting human being. His name is Prince Ratu Pandaji Pandita. He is descended from a line of kings that is unbroken for 12 generations. He is also descended from a man who transformed himself into a body of light in 1663 in front of his entire court. This man is recognized, the Prince Pandita, as a direct emanation of his great, etc. grandfather, Prince Pandiji Sakti. And he is one of the ruling families in Indonesia at this time. He is also recognized as a Maitreya, or a direct emanation. Anybody know what a direct emanation is? Now, this is a man who transformed himself into light. So why is he back? How does that occur? Yes? Just one second.
He's an incarnation to come back as a bodhisattva.
Okay.
Decided to take back the physical form to continue the teachings.
A direct emanation is somewhat different than a direct incarnation. An emanation occurs when a being who is transformed or become enlightened decides to come back for a specific purpose. This man's purpose is to come back and teach people how to transform themselves. This is what he teaches. And he's been recognized as a master in doing this. So, let's look at our general theory. There exists some evidence that points to a certain primordial lineage of human beings. The human beings can transform themselves into something that's beyond just the physical body. And that this matrix can be transcended by certain techniques. And that there is a spiritual world that once a human transforms, that they can potentially go into this world and live in a certain higher reality. So what is this spiritual world? What are the forces that govern this spiritual world? And how can human beings take advantage of these forces? And how may the primordial state be achieved by ordinary physical human beings? Now, one of the reasons I'm interested in this research is because I had contact when I was a resident with one of these primordial beings. And I wrote about it in a book called The Living Soul. And in the book, I describe a story. And in the story, I talk about my contact with a being who called himself Dajanti. I'd never heard that word before. And I was a second-year resident in psychiatry. And in your psychiatry residency, you stay up anywhere from 2 to 3 times a week doing what we call being on call. And when you're on call, you can go in on a Monday and not go home and get any sleep until Wednesday. And so I thought that I was hallucinating out of being fatigued and just not getting enough sleep and getting enough rest. One of the things that happened during my contact with this being is I learned that the being had another name. The other name this being had was Thoth. Has everybody heard that name before? Thoth? Now, as a doctor, I had a lot of trouble with talking with beings from other dimensions. As a psychiatrist, I couldn't really discuss it with my colleagues. But there were some patients I could talk to about it. There's one story I write about in the book about a man. I was on call one night. His name was, it was not his real name, but I called him Mr. Lanazuki. And Mr. Lanazuki was manic depressive. And we had admitted him because he had run from Germantown, Philadelphia, down to Central Philly, which is about 20 miles. But he did this in his boxer shorts and no shoes. And this was in the dead of winter in Philadelphia. So this is not something an old man in his 80s you would think would be able to do. But he did it. And the police brought him in, and he didn't stop running around for an hour or so by the time I saw him. But when I saw him, he said, "Doc, who is that glowing guy in the corner there? Big bald guy." And I thought, is he seeing the same thing I'm seeing? And so he said, "Oh, he looks like you a little bit too." I said, okay. So we had a conversation about my personal hallucination, which was no longer my personal hallucination. And grudgingly, over time, I had a lot of other experiences like this that began to show me that there's something to our universe, to our reality, that is higher than our world. That there are beings who are more intelligent than we are, beings that we don't write about in Harrison's textbook of medicine, or the DSM-3 or DSM-4, that have a great deal to teach us. So a lot of what I learned about the spiritual world came from my interaction with this being, which sounds a bit shamanic for lack of a better term, but that's what happened. And I waited 20 years to write about this for obvious reasons. I like practicing medicine. But I'm retiring next month, so I could talk about it as much as I like. There are forces that govern the spiritual world. There are also ways that human beings can take advantage of these forces and begin to evolve. One of the things that sort of got my attention as I was learning from this being is that the human body is quite different than what we think it is. One of the things I learned in genetics, that if you took all the DNA in one person, and this is basic molecular genetics, and you turned all that information into book form, the books that information would generate would fill up the Grand Canyon more than 75 times. That's a great deal of information for every one of us sitting here. Why is there so much information? The interesting thing about that is if you took all your DNA in one body and strung it end to end, it would go to the moon 500,000 times. Now, the really interesting thing about that is that we don't use most of our DNA. Most of our DNA just sits there. Actually, 97% of our DNA is totally unaccounted for by modern science. When you look at the human body, only about 2 to 3% of our DNA codes for every protein, every muscle, every enzyme, everything that we do. The rest of it has no known function at all, of any kind. They call it junk DNA. And there's actually two names for it. When you look at the physical body, sDNA, or silent DNA, is 97% of your body. It just sits there. It's silent, doesn't do anything. pDNA, or physical DNA, is anywhere from 1 to 3% in most people, which scientists find somewhat strange. Why would there be so much space? What is there about human DNA that we don't know that's generating all of this information? So, some interesting parallels come up when you look at human potential, when you look at human DNA, and when you look at the universe. We don't use 96% of our DNA. We also don't see 96% of the universe. There might be a connection there, if you look at it. And it's somewhat embarrassing because scientists now have to admit that 96% of the universe is totally beyond our comprehension. It would appear that the universe is made up of some unseen mass that we can't see and that we can't understand. But something in our physical body is already pre-wired to interact with that. There's an astronomer at the Department of Astronomy at the University of Washington that said that we can't find 90% of the universe. It's just not available. And there's another scientist who says that dark matter is Mother Nature having a double laugh at us, that it's not something that we can fully understand, that most of what we see in the universe is hidden. But ancient philosophers, Hindu, Druids, Kabbalists, Buddhists, etc., have written for centuries that the missing mass of the universe, this missing part, is called the spiritual world. And we're going to go into a lot of detail about what this world is. Where is it? Let's start with that. The physical world is still in the process of being created. There are people that are being born every day. There are plants that are being created every day. Everything in the physical world comes from something that pre-existed before it. If you put a seed in the ground, you can get an oak tree from that seed, but the oak tree obviously doesn't fit inside the seed. The tree can be 50 feet tall. The seed can only be maybe a half inch or so. It's coming from somewhere. For lack of a better term, let's call that place source. Now, this is an important slide. And we're going to break the dimensions down. We're just going to deal with the first 9 dimensions of reality. And this is a basic outline for the rest of our discussion on the spiritual world. The first dimension that we're going to deal with has to do with what we call the 9th dimension. And this is the dimension where what we would call God exists. Now, as humans, it's very difficult for us to understand the concept of God. The 9th dimension is the highest dimension that as humans we can begin to understand and put into words or a physical concept. Actually, not physical, but some sort of theosophical, let's call it theosophical construct. Then the dimensions emerge from this Godhead in a spiral fashion. Now, what's interesting about that is that DNA is also in a spiral fashion, an interlocking double helix, actually. And according to most cosmologists, the universe emerges from the inner world outward. And that we're kind of in the bad neighborhood part of the universe, in the 3rd dimension. We're way down here in the 3rd dimension. There are forces that interact or that act on the physical world that create the universe as we know it around us. These forces have names. And in spiritual research, which most of us probably haven't heard much about, these forces have been defined, they've been categorized, and there have been uses that have been applied for these particular forces that have been applied in meditation techniques. And in spiritual research, which most of us probably haven't heard much about, these forces have been defined, they've been categorized, and there have been uses that have been applied for these particular forces that have been applied in meditation techniques. We're going to talk about some of those techniques in a moment. The first force that acted upon the universe is called the A factor. What do you think that first force does? Just as a guess. Anybody want to guess? Now, this is what we would call God, and this is the first force acting to emerge what we would call reality in the form of the 8th dimension. What would this A factor force do? What does it do? Anybody want to take a guess? Raise your hand so we can use the mic.
Vibrate, make sound.
That's true. It does vibrate. What else does it do?
Could it be light?
It is light, that's right. But it has a very particular purpose that still acts on us today.
Create.
It does create, but what particularly does it create?
Well, I wasn't going to say what it was going to create. I was just saying its function was to expand.
Okay. That's very good. All of those answers are correct to a certain extent. A factor has one job. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Matter?
It does help create matter, that's right. Were there any other before I go into?
Catalyst?
It is a catalyst. That's warm. That's very warm. You want to go ahead with that? I do this to my students all the time.
Catalyst that infuses energy with purpose.
Okay. That's
Luminosity, radiance.
Let me go ahead and give it to you. Okay. But that's close. The purpose of A factor is to separate humanity or to separate reality from what we call God. It's called the factor of the first propagation. It separates everything that exists from what we call the state of non-existence or God. God would be, in our terms of discussion here, the term or the sum of all potentials. The A factor causes things to be created in their original primordial form. That's what A factor does. A factor acts through all the different dimensions. It causes a person to say, I am. I am Mitchell, I am a plant, I am an animal, I'm a fish, I'm a tree, etc., etc. It causes beings to want to express themselves in form. Before that, all things are formless. The purpose of the A factor is to give reality a form, a way that it can experience itself and experience the universe. Now, I'll give you B factor because that one's just too hard to guess. B factor acts on the fifth dimension for one particular purpose. B factor is a universal force that causes energy in the fifth dimension to be returned back to the ninth dimension or God. It's called, it's not the same as the A factor because the A factor has one goal. The A factor wants to push everything as far away from God as it can. But the B factor wants to turn things back to God. It's also called the immortality factor. It wants to make things immortal. The next factor is called the X factor. The X factor acts on the third dimension, which is where we live, to place things in the fifth dimension. Now, this is the source of a lot of the meditation practices that we just talked about that take advantage of this X force or X factor that exists inside of all of us. Every one of us have this. It's called, another word for it in our Western society, you might also call it the Christ force. Now, this force has one particular purpose. What do you think that purpose is if you call it the Christ force? Raise your hand.
Enlightenment.
Enlightenment, but something more than just enlightenment.
Transformation?
Transformation into what? We go back to our...
Primordial state.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. Very good. The X factor exists in all of us. You can measure it using certain techniques. The X factor has one goal. The X factor takes the 97% of our DNA and turns it into a light body. That's what the X factor does. That's its function. All of us walk around with the X factor being dormant inside of our bodies all the time. There are specific meditation techniques that have been devised over centuries to take advantage of that dormant state or that dormant force. There's another factor called Z factor that has a different sort of force or a different sort of action. Z factor is another term for death or chaos. The Z factor has one goal, and the Z factor's goal is to make sure that when you live a life, it makes sure that your body gets dissolved back into matter or back into the constituent parts of reality that created it. The Z factor also causes death and aging and illness. Were there any particular questions about that before we go on? Yes. Raise your hand. Just a second.
Do you make any correlations with those 9 factors and the 3 kayas?
With the 3 kayas?
Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Dharmakaya.
You want to explain that to the group?
Well, it's a Tibetan tradition. There are 3 Dharmakaya being pure essence, emptiness, awareness, and the Sambhogakaya being innate, unimpeded luminosity, which is the great array of appearances of Dharmakaya, and then Nirmanakaya being the great pure appearance of awareness.
We actually do.
It sounded like that's where you were going at it.
There's another question. There's another question right there.
There's a history of a discussion of people people in the Christian tradition and early Christianity talking about the body not corrupting, that certain saints have reached states where the body did not corrupt, and it was sort of a goal, and then they tied the fall to the fact that we had to corrupt, and before that we did not. And I was wondering if it was just the difference between the Z factor and
You ask a very good question.
X factor.
The question is, why do certain people, and it's not just Christians, it's in many traditions, it's happened to Hindus, it's happened in people in Judaism, it's happened to actually thousands of people. You can go into the Vatican and you can see incorrupt bodies. In a number of places in India, you can see incorrupt bodies. It's also happened to people in this country, among Native Americans, and in many places in Europe. What do you think causes that incorrupt state? Of the factors we just talked about, the X factor, the B factor, which one do you think causes that? It's X factor. Now, X factor can be generated. It's a dormant factor. Now, some people, when they generate this, their bodies begin to change. They develop healing ability. Their body begins to give off light. They begin to be able to float, for instance. They also begin to transform themselves, and because of the activity of this particular factor, people are often sainted. So what are some of the ways that this factor can be activated? Because one of the things that happens when you activate it, people become incorrupt. An incorrupt body is a body that doesn't decay normally. When I studied forensics, we had to study bodies in different forms of decay. And you can actually determine how long a person's been dead by the insects inside of that person at the time of your study. Certain insects come at particular times of decay. But an incorrupt body doesn't have that. There have been incorrupt bodies found in mud. And mud is one of the fastest ways people decay. Also, there have been incorrupt bodies found that have been hung in people that were crucified in the air. And the air is actually the fastest way that people decay. The air has more bacteria in it than the ground. Did everybody know that? So what are some of the ways that we might generate this X factor? Just if you think about it for a second. How does it come about? Yes.
Meditation or prayer?
That's right, meditation. And prayer. Anything else? Yes.
Through the breath, breathing techniques.
Well, let's call that meditation. There's a question over here.
Sacred sexuality. Sacred sexuality or Tantra.
We can use Tantra. But they don't like to talk about Tantra in the West because that's sex. But it is a path to enlightenment by using this factor. There's also one very powerful method we haven't mentioned yet.
Yoga?
Let's call yoga meditation. Okay. Tantra is also a form of yoga, but it's a very particular type of yoga. Yes, in the back?
Chanting.
What would you chant? What would you chant? You're close. Starts with an M, ends with a mantra. That's right. There's also another way to generate the X factor that we haven't talked about that you probably couldn't guess. Yes, maybe you could.
Under some type of crisis or stress that just happens, and then spontaneously something happens?
That's close, but not quite. Yes?
As far as technique or method or mode of delivery?
It's a mode of delivery.
Well, Choigal is the only way I know of as far as rainbow body, but that's a technique of meditation, so that would just fall into meditation probably.
There's another way. What's the biggest source of energy in our solar system? The sun. That's your hint. That's not your answer.
Light?
By using light. Exactly. Let's call it solar yoga. It's not yoga. but let's call it solar yoga. There's a technique by which you can take in sunlight, using sunlight in combination with a very particular type of meditation to transform yourself and take advantage of the X factor. Now, just for a moment, let's talk about sunlight. Because it's not just light. Now, sometimes when you're doing research in spirituality, you might notice that most of the ancient cultures seem to worship the sun in some form. In ancient Rome and Greece, they had gods for the sun. In the Babylonian tradition, there were gods for the sun. In Christianity, Christ was associated with the sun. In Judaism, there was a form of meditation that's associated with sunlight, taking in sunlight. Even in China and India, there's a solar aspect to worship. There are a number of different aspects to sunlight that help us with the process of evolution, that can also help lead us to a better understanding of the spiritual world. There are things inside of sunlight spiritually that most of us don't know about. So let's talk about them. One thing that's inside of sunlight, obviously, is electromagnetic energy. We call that light. That's the easiest thing to sort of understand about sunlight. When you look at the sun is bright. It gives off energy. But that's just one of the things inside of the sun that is being generated by the sun. The sun also generates something called information factors. What's an information factor? An information factor is pure energy being generated by the sun that contains information about the creation of reality. It's not electromagnetic in nature. And we're going to talk about those factors in a little bit. But they're called information factors. Yes. We're trying to get all this on tape, so I apologize.
I've never heard of information factors. Where did that come from?
Okay.
Sorry.
That's from a science called cursology. Anybody ever heard that term before? It comes from a combination of two words, cosmic and logos. And also, it's also called cosmic cursology or solar logos. So it's a combination of words that basically means information derived from the sun. Now, this is primarily information that has been passed down to us from the Gnostics. Has everyone heard of the Gnostics before? The Gnostics, especially the Essene Gnostic tradition, was a solar tradition, which essentially taught that human beings are derived from primordial beings that emanate from the sun, and that part of what controls our reality is an understanding of the higher forces that emanate from the sun and how the mind and the soul interact with them. So, let's get back to the list of things inside sunlight. Another thing that's inside sunlight is called the evolutionary factor. The evolutionary factor was only added to sunlight by certain beings about 250,000 years ago. One of the reasons this factor was added, according to the teachings, is that human beings began to become somewhat lazy and cumbersome in their understanding of the universe. The evolutionary factor was added to make us curious about the universe. Another thing that's inside of the sun that doesn't really fit into our normal understanding of what comes from the sun are called mandalas, specifically divine mandala. Divine mandala are geometric forms. If you look at sunlight, one of the things you notice if you begin to look at it for a while is you begin to see geometric shapes. And these shapes don't really make any sense when you first begin to look at them. But there's been an exhaustive study of these shapes by a number of some of the deeper esoteric spiritual religions. And it shows that these shapes have a tremendous effect on the subconscious processes of the human mind. What do you think these shapes do? What's the purpose? Why would the universe, or why would the sun emanate this energy? Divine mandala in particular.
Is it a mandate, if you will, to get back in touch with the primordial source, basic ground?
That's good. That's close enough. Essentially, it's a way to guide us back toward enlightenment. It contains information in a very highly complex geometric form that leads the subconscious mind on sort of a journey through life so that people develop a hunger for reality, for understanding the deeper forces of reality. It's where our desire to know God comes from. There's one other force.
Okay, wait.
Yes.
I attended a very erudite conference on crop circles. Some MIT scientists were there.
Mm-hmm.
One guy had a theory. This is really exciting. Now you're talking about the geometric shapes. That he reproduced the flat crop circle by putting geometric shapes underneath a source of very powerful energy. It was, they don't know what. But the shapes placed that way underneath created the crop circle at the bottom.
So how do you think that happened? How do you think that happens?
It's in your theory, doesn't it?
Well, it's not my theory, actually.
This theory.
Yes.
Does it not? It fits in with the geometric shapes you're speaking of.
But why does that happen?
It sounds like the crop circles were a sign of some kind.
Or they were stored inside of the energy so that under certain circumstances you can reproduce them. Actually, one of the things that composes the human body are these divine mandala. Each of us has stored inside of us certain mandala that once you master them will enable you to do things that look like miracles. They're not really miracles, but when you understand what the mandala does, you can control certain forces like gravity or the force of light or other forces in the universe that are connected to that particular mandala. That's a different study, though. The fifth thing that's inside of it are universal forces. One of those universal forces is the X factor. All of that comes through sunlight. Early in my training, I didn't believe any of this. I didn't, like some of you probably look at that and say, well, that's not possible. Well, I've learned to say that impossible just takes a little bit of time. Because as we grow in our understanding of the universe, we begin to see that what we thought was impossible 100 years ago is sort of accomplished in a daily manner now. So let's look at the spiritual world and the path and to what we call physical existence. The spiritual world starts from what we call the 99% world. Has everybody got this? Okay. Starts from what we call the 99% world, which is very similar to what Kabbalah teaches about there being a very evolved or much higher form of reality beyond our physical world from which all the other dimensions sort of derive. Our dimension is way down here, close to the 1% world, which is also something called null space, which is devoid of reality as we know it. It's a better way to look at that. It's not on this slide, though. Each of these dimensions, as you go down from the Godhead, or what we call the Creator, sort of devolves in complexity. So by the time you get to the fourth or the third dimension, reality is not quite as complex. Beings become subject to something we call death. So as we were talking about earlier, Christology is the science that we're talking about. It's a very ancient science that was propagated primarily by ancient Gnostics, primarily from the Essenes. Can I erase this now? Has everybody heard of the Essenes? The Essenes were a very, for lack of a better word, they were a very interesting group. And that's putting it very mildly. There are stories among the older ancient Essene cultures that they had a secret technique called the paradosis. Has anybody heard of that before? Okay. So the paradosis was a technique that involved taking in sunlight, among other things. And through the paradosis, one was able to transform themselves from a mortal being into an immortal being made of something other than physical matter. The paradosis was something that was only passed to the elder elect members of the Essenes, never to the women, which is sort of unusual, because if you're going to be immortal, why not have women around? But that's just me. So let's go over what these universal forces are. The paradosis takes into account one of these particular forces. In particular, takes into account the B factor, which we'll go over in a few minutes. These universal forces we're going to talk about, and I'm leaving one out on purpose. The A factor we're going to go over, the B factor we'll go over, X, Y, and Z factors. I'm leaving out the H factor because that's a factor that has to do with causing someone intentional harm. You can take advantage of that and learn about that when you're being trained in sort of the dark arts, but I don't train people or talk to people about that in particular. So let's talk about the factors one at a time. How are we doing on time? 20 minutes? Okay. The first factor, and I'm going over this a lot faster than I normally do, because we're condensing 2 days down into 3 hours. The first factor that we're going to talk about is called the A factor. And the A factor causes the propagation of self-propagation by which God is separated from himself and he disseminates himself throughout the universe. It's the first force that is taught in this science that is created. It's the first universal force that we have identified or that has been identified by the ancients. It's the first cause of emergence. One of my teachers was a Kabbalist, a very old Kabbalist, and I wondered just how old this guy was. But he told me a story about how the first force came into being, and I kind of like the story because it condenses it into something I could understand easily. He said, what if you knew a man who was extremely wealthy, and this man came to your home every day and said, I want to take you out to dinner and buy you things. And that might be cool the first time or two. And the next day this man calls and said, I want to take you out to dinner and show you the town. After 3 or 4 times of doing that, most of us would start to get a little bit uncomfortable that this person was doing everything for us. And that ultimately we would want to do some things for ourselves. So we would say, well, okay, if we go out to dinner today, let me pick up the check. And the man says, no, I insist. You can never pick up the check. It's always going to be me paying for everything. Well, most people eventually not want to go out with that man anymore. Why?
The matter of giving and receiving.
Because that's right. If in that relationship you feel like you have no power, you're constantly being given to, even though that's great for a little bit, but you have no power. And so my teacher said that this is the way that humans in the beginning, in the primordial state, saw God. That God was primarily giving us everything we ever needed, and we never had to do anything. And so that some of us said, I want to create my own apple pie. I want to create my own reality. I want to create my own everything so that I can feel the pleasure of giving things to myself. And so the first force was created by God as a way of pushing us into a universe where we could create things for ourselves. Now, some people like to say, well, I wasn't in that group. I didn't get consulted on that. But that's the way my teacher explained the propagation of the first force. It's a way to empower ourselves outside of the Godhead so that we could create reality and take advantage of it. We could work, we could get a wage, and give ourselves things that we needed. The next factor that came about is called the B factor. And the B factor is where the paradosis comes in. The A factor separates souls or spirits from God in the spiritual world. And it also caused death ultimately, because the ultimate separation from God is a form of death, in a way. The B factor was created as a counteractant or a counteragent to the A factor. And in the B factor, there is an urge to reunite with the source of all creation, with the Creator Himself. It is the force for spiritual evolution. In our higher levels of intelligence, B factor is extremely active. Now, in the ancient times, when the paradosis was taught, they would give the aspirant what they called the spiritual touch. And basically, they would touch you on the forehead. And the master would pass energy into the aspirant. And then the aspirant was given a mantra. But it wasn't really a mantra so much as it was a word. Now, in the Essene accounts of Jesus' baptism, it was essentially a paradosis or an event of the paradosis given by John the Baptist to Jesus himself. It's how Jesus was given the energy of divinity or higher divinity. And in the deeper mystery of that, Jesus was being initiated into a power that would later turn him into the Christ, the B factor, or the immortal factor, let's put it that way. It later immortalized him in a certain way. The X factor is another one of these forces that has a very specific job. The X factor is a force that takes the human form and is generated through there's two places the X factor comes from. It can come through all the areas we talked about, those 5 areas. It comes from the sun. Also, the earth generates a certain amount of X factor. And to be honest, the human body. Generates a certain amount of X factor. A friend of mine who is an astronomer at the University of Arizona talks about his research, and in his research, he did radio astronomy on the human body. If you look at the human body generates the same radiation as a star. So that radio telescopes had to be built far away from cities because human beings, when you point a radio telescope at a city, human beings light up like stars. We put out the same type of radiation. But one of these radiations is the X factor. It's very weak in most humans until they learn to bring it out more. This X factor has one focus, and that's to change the dormant 97% of human tissue into an immortal form. Now, there's a mantra that you can use, and this is a very ancient mantra. And this mantra is the embodiment of X factor. And the mantra will take X factor inside the human body, and if it's repeated under certain circumstances, 6,400,000 times, give or take 5 or 6 times, the human body transforms itself. Would you like to know what that mantra is? I've never had a group say no to that question. This is a J. Forgive my doctor's writing. It says, Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum. Now, this is a very ancient mantra. It's in Sanskrit, a form of Sanskrit. And the purpose of this mantra is several-fold. It slows down the aging process in humans. It also is called the immortal mantra. It energizes the X factor inside of humans. Also, it's a mantra that you can use with your solar meditation. Now, how do you think you might combine this mantra with your solar meditation? And my students can't say anything with this. You guys already know. How might you combine this mantra with solar meditation in order to accelerate the process of evolution?
Sit in the sun and say it.
That's close. That's very close. It does involve sitting in the sun. But what else?
The Buddhists use a prayer wheel. Can you put it on the prayer wheel and spin it? And
you sure could, but that's not what we're looking for. That's a good technique, though.
When you're sitting in the sun, you're just allowing the sun rays to penetrate you. So, I mean, you're opening yourself up and allowing the sun to go through you.
Let me give it to you. Has everybody got this? Yes. Om Ahum Vajra Guru. This is a U. I'm sorry. Pima Siddhi Hum. Guru. That's right. I'm sorry. Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum. Let me just give you a little bit of background about how you can apply this. I'm sorry?
I'm sorry. I just said, can you imagine doing it 6.4 million times and have it be wrong?
Well, that's exactly... Oops, got to start over. I left out a word, I think. The sun doesn't always radiate the same kind of energy. First thing in the morning, from sunrise to approximately 1 hour afterwards, the sun is radiating primarily X factor. From 1 hour before sunset till after sunset, the sun radiates B factor and a little bit of X. In the hours intervening, the sun is radiating primarily Y factor and Z factor, which are very destructive factors. Yes?
Does that change during daylight savings time?
The time that the sun is going to come up is going to change depending on where you are. For instance, if you were in the Arctic, there are times of the year where the sun is almost always in sort of a low 1 hour away from sunrise or sunset position. Well, at those times, you're going to always be getting X and B. X and B. Now, why am I giving you this? Well, for instance, if you're meditating first thing in the morning around sunrise, and the sun is emanating X factor, and you're saying this particular prayer, You're setting up a resonance between yourself and the sun. And you're setting up a pathway so that your body, instead of receiving a subconscious amount of X factor, you're going to start to receive many times more than the average person of X factor. So that you begin to accelerate the process of your own evolution. And this is actually a specific type of meditation where you get up first thing in the morning, you face the sun, and you don't just face it and sort of look at it with your eyes closed. There's a specific way to look at it. When you look at the sun first thing in the morning, sunlight's really different. Yes. Yes.
I have a question. Who's your teacher?
I've had several teachers.
I mean, in the Dzogchen tradition, who's your teacher?
It's not a Dzogchen teacher.
This is a
Toph
Dzogchen.
was my first teacher.
Well, what Tibetan Lama do you study with?
Wasn't a Tibetan Lama.
But this is a Dzogchen Ati Yoga practice you're talking about. And
it's
very,
actually older than that.
Oh.
Much
okay.
older.
There are serious prohibitions about giving this practice.
Well, this
you
isn't a Dzogchen practice.
This is a Dzogchen practice.
But it's older than that.
Okay.
So this is well known outside the Dzogchen community.
But you've not practiced with a Dzogchen master, right?
Not a Dzogchen master.
Are you a Buddhist?
I like Buddhism.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
I'd like to be in my hot tub for the rising sun. Is that okay?
You got a cool house.
I do. Please come.
So, in this technique, there's a certain way to look at the sun. First thing you do is you imagine that the sun is a disk, like a clock. And each of these disks, well, each part of the disk can be separated into 4 parts. And so you begin saying your mantra, Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum, at 12 o'clock. And you say it about this far, about 2 solar disk diameter away from the sun itself. And this is only at sunrise. Don't do this at midday when the sun is pretty bright. And at sunrise, the sun is not going to hurt your eyes. So you say it at each of these stations 5 seconds. So, Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum, you can say it about 2 or 3 times at each station. And then you repeat it at each station. You do that twice. So the whole thing will take you maybe 1 to 2 minutes. Now, I caution you not to do it more than 1 to 2 minutes for the first couple of months. Because what's going to happen is that this factor, this is a universal force. You don't want to take more than a couple minutes of that factor in during the first couple of months. Now, several things are going to happen as you begin to take in this force. What do you think might happen?
Probably sight and vision would become very expanded.
That's true. What else do you think might happen?
You could go blind because you look too directly at the sun. You're not
Actually,
doing
at sunrise, the sun is it's like a candle. It's not going to hurt you. Now, I've been doing this exercise for 18 years, and I have 20/15 vision, so it's not going to hurt you. Don't look at it when the sun is in X and Y factor. That's anywhere between the 2 hours after sunrise and 2 hours before sunset. That will hurt you. That will blind you. Yes?
I would think that your intuitive and your healing abilities would be augmented.
That's true.
Might you have a kind of spiritual experience or
you're going to have
catharsis
experiences. That's right. You're going to have experiences. The first thing you're going to download are those mandalas. And they're going to go directly into your subconscious. Those mandala are a little bit like God's instruction manual for your own evolution. They kind of guide you on a higher level as to what you can do with yourself as a spiritual being to evolve past the point where you are. That's the first thing that's going to happen. Second thing is you're going to start to take in sunlight into your body. Okay. Now, once sunlight goes into your body, it starts to transform you. And one of the things that it does is you become more intelligent. You begin to just know stuff out at the top of your head without even understanding how you know it. Your brain starts to wake up dormant areas. In some women, they have breast enhancement, and in some men, they become more virile. Your hair starts to change from gray to different colors. We need to take a break. How long is the break? Half an hour? So we'll pick up again at 4 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and do part 2. As I said earlier, I'm Dr. Mitchell Gibson, and this is part 2 of our presentation. I'm leaving a lot of information out because this is a 2-day seminar that I'm going over. And we're going over a lot in an hour and a half, but I think you're kind of getting a feel for a lot of the information that's been hidden from the public that I don't feel should be hidden from the public as much, because why shouldn't everybody have the opportunity to advance and evolve? It shouldn't just be held in cloistered groups, I believe. So that's why I do this. So you're going to hear some things you probably haven't heard before, and it's designed that way because this information has been put away for over 4,000 years. So there's certain people, and I'm one of them, that believe that it's time to start teaching everybody how to be on the same spiritual plane, wherever that is, and to give them the tools necessary to do that. So it requires somewhat of an open mind. It requires somewhat of a change in your worldview, because a lot of what I'm talking about you're not going to find in books. It is written in books, but those books are not disseminated for the public. I've been given permission to write about some of it and to teach about some of it, but a lot of it has not been released to the public yet. But what I'm talking about, it's okay to release that. Now, do we have any quick questions before I go on to the second part?
Could you interpret the mantra for us?
No.
You can't?
No.
Okay.
Not today. It would take too much time. Yes. But there is an interpretation for it.
Okay. There are a couple questions here about exactly how to perform this thing going around the clock. So,
that's a good question.
As I understand it, we say the mantra once at each of the stations of the clock, but you said something about twice.
Okay. Before I answer that, some people live in climates where you don't see the sun for weeks at a time. Or you may live in a place where, if you're in New York, for instance, you may live in a place where you can't see the sun because you're behind buildings, or you may live in the mountains and the sun may not come up until 2 hours after sunrise. So one thing that you can do is remember that all light comes from one source. And if you light a candle, the candle is going to radiate all the energy that comes out of the sun in a miniature fashion. So you can look at a candle at sunrise at the same time and do the same exercise and get the same effect. Now, I would not look at a candle for the same effect from the hours that I talked about that emanate Y and Z factors, because those factors are destructive. But you can use a candle first thing in the morning between sunrise and an hour after sunrise. Has the same effect. It also has the same effect at sunset. And actually, in some of the dark retreat exercises, you use a candle and you don't use sunrise, or you don't use the sun. Was there another question?
The same question she had is, do you stop at each of the stations once or twice?
I'll go over it again. Let's say that this is the sun. Okay? And there are stations around, and you're going to look at it, if this is one disk, so you're going to look at it about that far away from the sun. Okay? And at each point around the sun, you're going to be 2 solar diameters away from the disk of the sun. You're not going to look directly at the sun, at least in the beginning. And you just go around the sun clockwise. And you're going to repeat it twice. Om Ahum Vajra Guru Pima Siddhi Hum. Repeat it here twice, here twice. And you go all the way around it. That's one rotation. You repeat it for what's called 2 rotations. Is that clear? Okay.
When you say when you go around, stop at the station or go around the stations, are we moving physically or our eyes
You're only moving your eyes to an imaginary point equivalent to the point of a clock.
Thank you.
Okay? Just your eyes. And you're looking at the sun with your eyes open. At sunrise, it's not going to hurt your eyes. Okay? We'll take one more and then we'll move on.
And the disk, again, is just what you perceive the size of the sun to be when you look at it. Then you just move up 2 times whatever the sun circle is to you. Thank you.
Right. That's right. Now, I've been doing this and other more advanced techniques, and believe me, this is a very basic techniques for almost 20 years. So I can look at midday sun in Arizona for an hour and it doesn't hurt my eyes. There are techniques that involve using certain crystals that are attuned to your specific birthplace, date, and time. And there are certain crystals that help you take in specific factors. For instance, an emerald, combined with certain techniques, focuses sunlight for X factor. Okay? If you use a CZ, now you can get CZs in pretty good size. CZs give you B factor, cubic zirconium. They're cheap. You can get them on eBay for $20. Pretty good size ones. Rubies they sort of filter for the evolutionary factor and a little bit for B factor, but mostly for the evolutionary factor. That really speeds up the pace at which your subconscious mind processes spiritual mandala. I don't give those techniques out in classes like this, but there are ways you can use crystals to accelerate that process. There are other crystals that you can use, but we won't go over those today. Okay. X factor is primarily then responsible for the creation of the light body. That's what it does. It's also when you generate your light body, it's something that is existent primarily in the fifth dimension. Now, everybody here already has a light body that's dormant, or a Vajra body that's dormant inside of you. And you also have an analogous form that's dormant inside of the sun. And if you never do these practices, that part of you just remains in the sun. It just remains there. And nothing ever really happens with it. But if you do choose to do these exercises and bring it about, that part of you will begin to grow and communicate with you. But all of us have one of those. Now, the Y factor is another force that we don't work with in groups like this. And it's generated from the fifth dimension, and it creates a desire for what we call self-expression. It's also a force that generates what we call chaos. So it's also called one of the chaos factors. The Y factor is responsible for, among other things, the creation of the human subconscious. In beings in the fifth dimension and above, they don't have a subconscious. Why do you think it's necessary for humans to have a subconscious? Why did God specifically help us create that? Yes.
Connection, I think, to other dimensions.
Okay.
Possibly.
I was going to say protection.
Protection, exactly. Protection from what?
Protection from the things that we're defending ourselves against.
Protection from things we need protection against. Yeah. That works almost.
Sorry. I don't feel very articulate with that answer. Anyone else?
I'll give you a hint. It has to do with those mandala we talked about. Yes.
Okay, you were going to start talking and threw me off. I was just going to say protection in the disharmony when we went to self-express.
Okay. There's a man in the back.
It gives us a place to store the imprints and information that can't be processed in the immediate moment.
That's right. And that's exactly right. We are being constantly bombarded with billions of bits of data from the sun. In this dimension, we cannot process that. The human conscious mind is only able to process a few bits of data per second. The average person speaks at about 250 to 300 words per minute. Well, if somebody were to speak to you at 1,500 words per minute, you wouldn't understand it. But the sun puts out information that goes much faster than that. That information goes directly into your subconscious and works its way from your deep unconscious to your subconscious to your preconscious over time. In that way, your mind isn't overwhelmed by the information that's made available to it. That only happens in the lower dimension, because in the higher dimensions, beings are able to take information directly from the universe and process it very quickly without being overwhelmed. The average human cannot do that. It would just be too much for us. For instance, if you've ever done drugs or alcohol, and I won't even ask that question, but if you've ever done drugs or alcohol, assuming that you've ever done that, and you inhaled, has anybody ever gotten that feeling where they heard a lot of words or saw a lot of color or visions that just came in real fast at the same time? Not that I've ever done that, but has anybody else ever had that experience? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, then you know kind of what I'm talking about. What's happening is that the universe is normally putting out a cacophony of sound and light and words that we're constantly being bombarded with. All of that stuff gets put into the information in your subconscious through the action of Y factor. So it's like a protective mechanism, but protecting us from the universe. and the information we're being bombarded with. So you were half right. The Z factor is a self-destructive force that emanates from the fourth dimension, and its primary goal is to make sure that things die. Now, why is it important that things die? Why is it important that beings experience death? Death is sort of a misnomer. It's not real in the way that we think of death, but why do you think it's important? Why do you think God put that into the system? What was the importance of putting that in?
So that we get another chance at evolving the human race, that we come back and evolve?
This is a hard question, so I'm going to give this to you. Because you won't get this one, but you can try. Go ahead.
Things can't stay static. They have to change. And to make room for the new things, the old has to die.
Okay. So let me give you sort of a quick lesson in spiritual mathematics using these forces. You have the X factor and the Y factor and the Z factor and the B factor. These are the only ones we're really going to work with, and a little bit of the A. Now, when a person is alive, there are two factors that keep you alive, that keep you functioning. Those two factors are the X factor and the B factor. Those two factors stored inside the human body keep us alive. We call that life force. Okay? Those two factors are impelled by the action of the A factor. The A factor pushes us into reality and pushes us to take advantage of the life force. Those two factors are balanced by the Y force and the Z force. So you have life on the top, and you have death on the bottom. Does everybody follow me on that? So the life forces are the X and the B. That's another way of looking, a little bit more advanced way of looking at life force. The Y force and the Z force cause death, basically. When a person leaves this world, when a person dies, something unusual happens. When you're born into the world, you're pushed into the world by the action of X and B. As you get older, this number gets larger. So when you're born, this number may be a ratio of 10 to 1, depending on how long you're supposed to live. So if you're supposed to live 80 years, this number might be 80 to 1. But what happens as you get older? Most people don't take advantage of X and B factor. They don't know how to store that in their bodies. So over time, this number goes from 1, because we store up Y and Z, and you don't have to do anything to store up Y and Z. Y and Z factors are stored in food. Certain foods are higher in Y and Z factor than others. The food that has the highest amount of Y factor is pork. And many religions ban pork without really teaching you why. But pork has a very strong destructive life force inside of it. As you get older, you might build up these two forces to where these two forces become even. The moment one outstrips the other, we call that aging. As the forces become imbalanced. And when they become imbalanced to a certain degree, we call that death. The physical body dies. When the physical body dies, it no longer becomes subject in the same degree, because without the physical body, we have nothing to store the Y and Z factors in. So in the process of death, we're basically throwing off Y and Z force. Then we're brought back into the cycle of life by the action of X and B. And we start all over. So that technique was created so we could learn how to tilt the balance in our favor so that eventually we could become immortal. When these two numbers reach a critical mass, they totally cancel out the numbers on the bottom so that your body no longer becomes subject to death. And that's basically what a light body is. It's a physical body that has canceled out all of the effects of the negative universal forces acting on the physical form. I normally take 2 hours to go over that, so you guys are a bright group. What's that?
Just one question about the age factor.
The age factor?
The aging
Yes.
factor. So
We don't talk about the age factor.
So you said we come in with almost the numbers plugged into the formula
That's
already?
Right. We come in with a certain amount that's stored inside the soul.
Does that vary from individual to
It
individual?
varies from individual to individual, depending on certain forces acting on you and certain choices.
Could you just throw out just a few more of the X, Y factors, or they're like pork? What else is there that?
Are there other things? The things that store Y and Z factors are called detritus. Detritus is another word for spiritual debris or negative energy. The thing that has the highest amount of detritus is pork, far and away. Alcohol has a high degree of detritus. Okay. Nicotine has a high degree of detritus. Cemeteries have a high amount of detritus, just the energy in cemeteries, because of the dominance of Z force there. So they're not good places to build a house. Certain sounds have a high amount of detritus. The sound of cursing, the sound of negative language or negative words have a high amount of detritus in them. That's just a partial list, but you kind of get the idea. Yes?
Pork. Why pork? Do you have an idea?
I don't know. Don't know. Never have known that. Yes?
What about negative words like that come out of depression, as in poor me?
Interestingly enough, if you say certain negative words to plants, they react to it. They know that that negative force is there, and the detritus will begin to have a negative effect on them. People are the same. If you look at a person that, for instance, somebody who's a gothic death metal artist, everybody know what gothic death metal is? It's a really, and this is my personal opinion, it's an awful kind of music where a person intentionally tries to sing like a demon with a really deep, throaty voice, and they cuss a lot. Well, when you talk to those people, I've had a number as clients, they look awful. They age more quickly than normal, and they have usually lifestyles that lead to an early death, like a lot of rap artists, for instance, that use a lot of cursing in their music. When you look at their lives follow the music, in part because of the words that they use. Yes? We're giving you a workout today, aren't we?
What about somebody who works a lot with the ill and dying people? Is that?
Let's not go over that.
You mentioned on immortality. Is that a one-time deal? Once it's achieved, then you don't have to work to eliminate those factors, or they don't come back?
That's right. Those factors are totally eliminated forever. Now, you can send a direct emanation back into the world, but that's only a copy of yourself. That's not you. And some Maitreya's or people who become enlightened will do that as an example of what's possible. And once they become enlightened, they send a copy of themselves back into the world to teach people that this is what is possible. The person, Prince Pandaji, that I showed you, is an example of a person that did that. The Buddhas are an example of people that have done that. And there have been a number of other people after that. But they're not people in the same way that you and I are. They're copies of a person.
So Bodhisattva would be one almost...
Bodhisattva, Avatar, Maitreya, same thing.
Okay.
They're copies of the same soul. They come for a specific purpose.
So these copies, are they not subject to detritus, the copies?
They're subject to the same force as any physical body is, but they're created for a specific purpose, and when they dissolve, that person's not coming back. They were created for a specific purpose at a specific time. And the original soul that created them is not in the world. It's only an emanation of that person. They're called Maitreyas or avatars. Okay? Z factor is the dominant factor in the third dimension. Z factor has an important function in that it creates the ego. The ego is a part of the physical form that creates self-expression. Z factor also creates aging, illness, and death. The ego is the part of us that gives us an identity. It's also the part of us that separates us even more from what we understand as God. It says that I'm the only thing that really exists, and maybe God is my invisible buddy, but he's really not real. I'm the only thing that's real. The ego is a part of us that says that. That's an action of the Z force. Okay. Let's skip this for now. So let's look at what some of these beings in other dimensions look like. And this is taken from a Kosology textbook, which I can't give you the textbook, but I can give you some of the pictures. Now, the first being is what we call a theomorphic being. Theomorphic beings categorize beings that live in the fifth dimension and beyond. Theomorphic beings have no sex. They're not male, they're not female. They're also self-generating. Remember this formula that I just gave you? I'm sorry, X plus B over Y and Z. Remember that formula? Well, these beings have no Y and Z force at all. Y factor and Z factor create separation of the sexes. When a person has only X and B factor operating, they become what we call self-generating. What do you think that means?
Immortality?
Immortality, but more than that. It means you can give birth to yourself continuously without the need of parents. So once a person becomes enlightened, and once a person gains fifth dimensional consciousness and gains a light body, that body becomes self-sustaining and self-regenerating. And it never dies because it doesn't have those lower factors that we talked about acting on it. It only has the higher forces acting on it. Theomorphic beings. Now, this is a scale picture of beings from other dimensions. If you notice, let's say this is an average third dimensional human male. and an average third-dimensional human female. Let's say this human male is 6 feet tall. Let's say this human female is about 5'5". Look at this theomorphic being, how much taller. This being may be 8, 9 feet tall. Well, in my interactions with them, that's how big they are, if not bigger, compared to us. Also, there's something different about them that we don't have. If you look at this being and this being and this being, other than size, what do you notice? Yes. Exactly. There's a light around this being, there's a light around this being, but there's none around us because humans don't glow. Human beings, the average normal human being, does not glow. Unless you've gone through the full stages of enlightenment. Have we talked about enlightenment, the stages? Okay. I'm sorry. If a human being has gone through the stages of full enlightenment, then that human being becomes at least theomorphic, at the very least. So let's talk about what those stages are. There are two parts of enlightenment. The first part is called inner enlightenment. The human soul is a roughly gem-shaped object that has 617 facets. It looks like a diamond, and it has different colors depending on the age and the evolution of the soul. So it might look something like this. Okay, but at the moment of inner enlightenment, the soul becomes spherical and looks like a pearl. The soul also becomes immortalized so that the person is no longer subject to the force of reincarnation. They change the soul enough so that the Y and Z forces no longer act on them in a certain way. So the soul can't be drawn back into what we call samsara. Samsara is a Hindu word or Sanskrit word that refers to reincarnation. Samsara is that cycle that the Y and Z force create so that a person dies and comes back, dies and comes back. If a person goes through inner enlightenment, they don't have to come back. Now, inner enlightenment is only the beginning of the process. If a person continues certain practices, they go through what we call outer enlightenment. And outer enlightenment has 4 stages. The first stage is called, well, these aren't necessarily sequential. Or gnosis. In the first stage, a person that is going through the process of outer enlightenment, their body begins to be nourished by the energy of the universe directly. They don't need to eat. They may eat because they like to, but they don't have to. That's called inedia. And there have been literally thousands of instances of people throughout history that have demonstrated not needing to eat or drink anything. That's because they get all of their energy from the universe itself. And we are bathed in a universe that's full of energy. But because our bodies are devolved to the point that we become solid beings, we have to take in solid matter to maintain the body. The next thing that happens is that the body begins to give off light, which is why we led to this discussion. The body gives off light because the soul begins to take in energy from the universe and begins to heal itself. It begins the process of starting self-regeneration. So that it no longer needs parents to be born into the world. A normal soul needs the action of a mother and father to be born into the world. If you remember stories about ancient legends of people who were enlightened, often they were placed directly into a mother. Or sometimes they just sprang fully born out of nowhere. That's because of the action of X and B factor. The aura means that the soul becomes self-generating. It gives off light. It can heal. It can raise people from the dead, that sort of thing. Laetitia is also important. If you look very closely at this diagram, you notice that this man's feet are planted on what's kind of loosely associated with the ground, that little line there. These beings are floating. Very subtle, but you kind of see that if you notice. The woman as well. That's because of the action of Laetitia. These beings are no longer subject to the forces that human bodies or physical forms are subject to. They can float. So when you see a primordial being or a being that has evolved to the point of full enlightenment, they can float. And the last thing is logi or gnosis. They just know everything. You can ask them anything and they'll know everything because they're connected directly into the mind of God. And it's more than music, the mind of God. Okay. The diffusion factors, we're not talking about the H factor, but the Z factors, once a person dies, begin to pull the body apart. So in a normal person who hasn't done any spiritual practices, when a person is placed in the ground or whatever, the body begins to decay. And the person can either continue to decay and go back on the wheel of reincarnation, or that person can go into what we call the first dimension, which is being broken down into very small, discrete bits of matter that is very difficult for that matter to come back into the universe. Now, this is a fifth-dimensional being, theomorphic, roughly 8 to 9, 10 feet tall, sometimes bigger. This is the first being that I experienced from the spiritual world. This being's name was Tall, in the instance that I experienced. There are also beings that are living in the fourth dimension. A fourth-dimensional being is a hermaphrodite. Hermaphrodites in the fourth dimension have male and female characteristics. They sort of look like a perfect cross between men and women. They have breasts, and they can be subtle breasts, or they can be larger breasts. And they have a penis and they have a vagina. They have all the sexes combined. But they can also self-fertilize. They can have babies by themselves. So they can get themselves pregnant. They don't need other sexes because they combine both sexes. They don't need another fourth-dimensional being to create a child. But they have to have sex, either with themselves or voluntarily with another fourth-dimensional being. Fifth-dimensional beings don't need sex. They can just think about it and emanate another being, a copy of themselves. And this is due to the force of the early Z factor and the Y factor combined. In human beings, actually, let me also mention that in the fourth dimension is where the unconscious begins to create itself. These beings in this dimension have no subconscious or unconscious. Fourth dimensional beings have an unconscious but no subconscious. The difference being, and it's sort of challenging to explain it quickly, but the subconscious is a part where we store information that would otherwise overwhelm us. In the unconscious, God communicates with us directly, without an intermediary. In the fourth dimension, these beings can still communicate with God, but it's relegated to the unconscious. So they still have a lot of power. They still have a lot of evolutionary energy that we don't have access to. And they tend to be larger. They're called dark beings because when you look at them, their aura has sort of it's light, but it can be a specific color like red or green or blue. Whereas theomorphic beings, they tend to be white or gold. In the hermaphroditic fourth dimensional beings, the aura takes on a specific color, usually one of the primary colors, depending on the nature of the being. In the third dimension, which is where we are in the spiritual world, the bad neighborhood, the sexes become split. so that they're no longer hermaphroditic or theomorphic, and in order to have children, we have to have sex. And in this dimension, men look different than women, and they also have different physical characteristics. In the second dimension, people take on somewhat of a transparent appearance. They have, we call them ghosts or spirits. They don't have a physical body anymore. They still have a form that you can relate to and that you can see. And we'll talk more in detail about the second dimension in a little bit. In the first dimension, the best way to imagine that is just little tiny sparks of light where beings are polarized as positive and negative entities. Okay? Any quick questions about that? That always generates questions. So,
I know a lot of people that have experienced spirit guides in both negative and positive experiences. And I'm wondering if these experiences, which I've never seen this before, I've never really considered the second dimension, and if there's a possible negative force there as opposed to the higher that you ascend into greater consciousness of fourth, fifth dimension and beyond, it seems that you're moving toward ultimate purity.
That's right.
But I'm wondering if the negativity, so-called, of these spirit guides, and I know some people with some very bad experiences, I'm wondering if that comes from, where that comes from, if it could be in the second dimension.
In my experience, most spirit guides are second dimensional. That doesn't mean that all spirit guides are second dimensional, but as a psychiatrist, I've seen a lot of people, and because I have somewhat of a spiritual open mind, I get a lot of people that believe they're being guided by spirits. And when I talk to the person, and when I look at the spirit, I can see who the spirit is pretending to be and who the spirit really is. And I would say 9 times out of 10, the spirit is pretending to be something they're not. Because I can see through the spirit, and I can see that they don't have any of the theomorphic characteristics I would expect to see in a higher being. They're just dead people pretending to be something they're not. Once in a while, I will see a theomorphic being attached to a person. But theomorphic beings don't attach to humans primarily. They will guide a human from a distance, or they appear for a specific amount of time, and then they'll leave that human to make a choice. But they don't usually attach to a person and tell you what to do day after day. A sign that it's an attaching spirit or a negative spirit is that they stay with you and they try to force you to do something, or they become almost belligerent, or they attach to a certain part of your body. Theomorphic beings don't attach to human beings. They just don't do that. Negative spirits or second dimensional spirits will almost always attach in order to guide you. Big difference. Another question over here?
When you were talking about the aura and not needing, right, they can just be placed inside, birth themselves almost, I guess you were saying. And I was thinking about Christ. We talk about the Virgin Mary, and I was wondering, is that what's happening? I'm kind of confused there.
That legend about Christ is not only true for Christ, but also true for a number of spiritual leaders, where they are essentially introduced directly into a mother. That is true of a number, and I can think of a number of legends where beings were directly emanated into a person or were directly brought forth from another human. But Christ is one of those myths or legends that it's associated with. But there have been a number of others. We'll take one more and then we'll move on.
Back to the light, the first dimension?
Yes.
You said light beings?
No, particles of light.
Okay, particles of light.
Yes.
Do you include the orbs in that or not?
No, the orbs are primarily second dimensional. We'll take one more and then we'll go on.
I wanted to ask you about the symbol that you drew for the pearl for inner enlightenment. And you put little rays coming out at 4 quadrants. Were you just elaborating on that, or is that something else?
It points to the fact that the soul becomes not subject to reincarnation.
I'm sorry. I'm talking about the specific thing you drew on the board. You drew a circle and you drew rays coming out at for...
that points to the fact that it's no longer subject to reincarnation.
I understand. But is that a symbol that is
that
you've seen elsewhere?
It's a Christology symbol, yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, it is. Good pickup. This is another symbol from a Christology textbook. Should I go over this? No. Let's talk about the first, because I could spend an hour on that, and we don't have an hour. Let's talk about the first dimension. The first dimension is a dimension that is characterized by chaos and complete unconsciousness. Now, as I talk about each of these dimensions, we all have an aspect that lives in all of these dimensions. Don't think of yourself as being separate from these dimensions. Think of yourself as being continuous with all of these dimensions. Because all of us have a continuous nature. It's a misnomer. It's incorrect to think of yourself as just existing in the third dimension. We all exist as a multidimensional entity. So when you look at the first dimension is dominated by the A factor. Remember that factor that pushes beings away from God? The ultimate result of the A factor is to push beings so far away from God that they have to come back. And so the first dimension is the last place that a being can exist as what we would call an entity. But it's completely unconscious of itself. It doesn't know itself for what it is in the first dimension. Now, when we first come into the universe, we come into the universe as small, unconscious particles of energy. And those unconscious particles of energy have to go through something to experience life. What drives their ability to make or to experience reality? Choice. We start out in the first dimension as unconscious particles. We begin to make unconscious choices we're not aware of. And even now, most of our choices in the third dimension are still unconscious. 9 out of 10 thoughts that we have, we don't remember and we don't understand when they happened or why. In the first dimension, 100% of the time, we're not aware of our thoughts. But choice is what compels us to evolve. In the first dimension, consciousness or the soul begins to try to go back to God, or it starts to make the process of incarnation. Now, we don't start out directly as humans. Becoming a human is a privilege. It's a privilege of making a lot of good choices. So let's take this little bitty soul. It starts out as a first dimensional little particle of light. The first thing that it's going to do, and let's just simplify the discussion, is it's going to take on the simplest form of life that it can become. It becomes a virus or a bacterium. Now, viruses are millions of times smaller than bacteria, but for the sake of our discussion, let's just put them in the same group. Okay? Now, these are unconscious choices. This particle, being pure life force, can very easily form these simple life forms. The next thing it will do is it will become a multicelled organism or protozoan. Still not human, but it is evolving rapidly. Now, this process can happen in a few days. So it can be very quick. Or it can take thousands of years to happen, depending on the soul. Then it can become a plant. or a mineral. Plants and minerals are alive. They have life force inside of them. And then it can make the jump to become a higher animal. How does it make that jump? What would you guess?
Some sort of intention?
Yes. How does it make that jump? You're going to kick yourselves when I tell you.
I was just wondering if it was moving from the first dimension to the second dimension.
Well, it doesn't require that move. I'll tell you. It has to be consumed. So the plant is eaten by a lower animal, or the plant is eaten, or the mineral is eaten. How does a mineral get eaten? Your food contains minerals. Plants contain minerals, etc., etc. So the higher animal might be a cow, or it might be a dog, etc., etc. Okay? Or it might be any type of lower animal, but it has to be consumed. From that state, the soul makes a tremendous evolutionary leap, a quantum leap, basically. And that's how souls get to evolve. It's still not human. So then how can it get to be human? It can be consumed. We can eat that cow. And because we ate that cow, through the law of resonance, that cow's energy that started out as a particle now begins to resonate with human energy. That particle now gets a chance to become human. The other way is if you kill that animal. If you kill an animal, that animal gets a right to become human. Any animal that you kill, that a human kills. There's another way. Yes.
Through companionship? Loving the animal through companionship?
If the animal dies in the presence of a human that loves it. That's exactly right. That animal gets to evolve. So if you buy a monkey and you love that monkey, let's say the monkey's name is Bubbles, for instance, and Bubbles dies in your presence, then Bubbles gets to be human next time. Or for some reason you consume Bubbles, Bubbles gets to be human. Now, how do humans get to be the next level? Light beings. Well, you can't consume a light being, can't do that. And you can't kill one. Yes?
Doctor, I'm sorry, I just had a quick question. The implication seems to be that you can't go from plant mineral to human.
You can't make that jump directly, no.
So, if you have to consume a higher animal in order to become human, but you have other alternatives, you can kill it or you can be in its presence when it dies, it kind of limits you. It limits vegetarians, for instance.
Vegetarian humans?
Yes. Oh, I'm seeing that.
Yeah, the question I have is this a guided process?
Yes. There are beings that are responsible for this.
quick question. Is there any repercussions of an animal killing and eating a human?
Of animals killing humans? Yes. Are there any implications?
Yes.
What do you think?
Well, part of me thinks it's a negative connotation, but I'm not sure.
No.
They go up the chain also?
They get to move up.
All right.
The animal gets to become human. In the same way that, the animal gets to become human. Yes.
What is your source for this information?
What is my source? Let's talk about my sources. Can I erase this? Actually, we haven't finished this question. Let's finish that question and we'll go over to sources. So how does a human become a light being, getting itself into the next rung of this ladder? Yes.
What I don't know, what I follow myself flowing into is that there's some kind of awareness, there's some kind of process or guide occurring. I mean, somewhere along the line, an awareness of moving to the next level, or wanting to move to the next level must begin to occur. So if we're going to move into the human, to that next level of lightness, then something's happening that there's a desire to, that I'm working toward. Somehow I'm aware of the need to or something.
That's right. That's right. So how do humans move? It takes more than desire.
So you're saying, other than like going through your karmic wheel, you had to basically go from element all the way up through the soul consciousness of the food chain, in a sense, to evolve through that before we can become human.
Every one of the humans in this room has been through this.
Okay.
That's how we got here, unless you're a direct emanation.
Do we evolve through enhancing the X and B factors?
How do you
into
do
light beings?
How do you do that?
Well, through the technique you gave us and various other things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the whole purpose of this seminar, to help human beings go from here to here. Most of us are stuck right here and going back and forth between the animal and the human kingdom. There's another choice out there. So one thing that you can do specifically is solar yoga. The beginning of which is, the first practice of which is what I gave you.
I imagine the other is, as the animal, did you sacrifice yourself to the higher or surrender to the higher?
No, not quite. There are a lot of people that used to believe that. The difficulty with that is you throw yourself back several notches. That's a form of suicide. That actually builds up detritus in your mind from a lot of negative energy you bring on yourself.
I was thinking the crucifixion.
Crucifying yourself?
The crucifixion of Jesus, was that a surrender to the higher?
That's a long discussion.
Okay.
That's a very long discussion. But let's talk about the ways you can evolve yourself from being human to light beings. We talked about solar yoga. There are specific mantras. Solar yoga involves taking in sunlight in a specific way at a specific time, using specific yoga positions or mudras. Does everybody know what a mudra is? A mudra is movement of the hands. Sometimes you can combine a mudra with the movement of the body while looking at sunlight in a certain way, and it causes the transformation. Another is a mantra. There are specific mantras that you can get that will transform your body simply by saying them, one of which is the one I gave you. But you have to combine that one with some solar yoga techniques. There are also words of power. A word of power is basically a force of nature that sounds like a word. And a word of power can transform a human directly. And the last way that we talked about a little bit is called the paradosis. where you take the energy from someone who has gone through the transformation and they put the energy inside of you. And it starts a catalytic process that just runs itself like a computer program. It's like they download the necessary information into you, and it causes a transformation. It's called the paradosis. Does everybody have all these? Yes.
Does the paradosis, it comes from another light being? Is that what you said?
Yes.
It has to be downloaded by another light being?
Yes.
Okay.
That being has to touch you in order to do that.
And so the paradosis is like dissension of grace or Shaktipat.
That's right. That's right. Or God himself can do that for a person. In the case of Jesus, he had the paranosis through John the Baptist, but God was inhabiting John the Baptist's body at that time. So it wasn't just John, it was God. So where am I? Yes.
And can you give us some examples of the words of power?
No. Next question.
Can we move to sources now?
Yes.
Thank you.
Has everybody got this? There are a number of sources. The biggest one actually comes from the sun. And there's a race of beings that once a human's intelligence evolves to a certain point, they become aware that that human is evolving. It's much like if a dog came up to you and asked you for $1. You would take notice of that dog. You would treat that dog differently than you would its neighbor that didn't ask you for that $1. That race is called the Bastaga. The Bastaga are an extremely advanced race of beings that monitor human evolution. And they begin to communicate with humans through the sun once a human learns certain solo yoga techniques. I've had several masters, one of which was a lady by the name of Indira Devi, who was the emanation of the direct avatar of the goddess Lakshmi. That's the only one I can really talk about in public. Also, through certain Christology texts, you might have noticed that some of the slides I'm showing you look like they're taken out of a textbook. Those texts are not distributed to the average public. They are not disseminated, let's put it that way. They're forbidden, so to speak. But certain things I'm now allowed to teach because, well, I also left out Thoth, but actually he prefers the Janti. Those are some of my sources, not all of them, but some of them. Yes.
What is Kosalarji? What is that? Number 3 up there.
Were you at the first lecture earlier today?
No.
Okay. Kosology is a short for Cosmic Solar Logos, which is an ancient science that teaches that the sun and the universe are connected through a series of informational or universal forces. There are texts written about Kosology, hundreds of them. And it's primarily a science that was initiated about 4,000 years ago, propagated through oral transmission initially, and then through Gnostic texts, and then through Kosology texts. But a good source of information is, if you really want to get a good answer to a question, you can go get up in the morning around sunrise and ask a question directly from the sun. And the sun will give you an answer. Now, the answer will go almost immediately into your subconscious, actually first into your unconscious. And from your unconscious, that answer will gradually work its way up into your conscious mind. But most people won't listen to that answer. They'll kind of ignore it or block it out. Or the answer sometimes will not be direct. It will be through a book passage, or someone will tell you. Or you'll be sitting at a mall or something, and someone just comes up to you and starts talking to you, giving you the information that you need, but sometimes you don't listen. So information is propagated not in the way that you might expect throughout the universe, but an aware individual becomes aware that God speaks in mysterious ways. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I have a question, Doctor, please.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think this information is suppressed?
I think for several reasons. For one, for a very long time, the church was afraid that if people had certain information about the Bible, they wouldn't tithe, and that they wouldn't be afraid of the afterlife. And so the information about the afterlife, Christianity teaches almost nothing about that. And I'm pointing out Christianity because it's the dominant religion on this planet. So I would say the first reason is fear. The second reason is that the people, the masses that have the information, understand that the masses have not been educated, let's say, spiritually. And at this time, people in this room, you have a greater spiritual education than almost anybody that's lived before you. 100 years ago, 9 times out of 10, if you met a person on the street, that person couldn't read. Right now, about 70% of the people in this country can read. 500 years ago, only nobility and the educated elite could read. So 500 years ago, you couldn't pick up a copy of the Bible at a bookstore and read it. You had to go into a square and somebody would read the Bible on certain days, and you had to pay to hear that Bible being read. So information like this, of necessity, went underground because the average person was not given even basic spiritual education.
So then you're saying this information is Bible-based?
No, didn't say that.
Then please clarify.
I'm not sure of your question.
Well, you were responding to why this information is suppressed. And
primarily fear.
Okay.
Okay, not to backtrack too much, but what I'm saying, okay, you're saying the beings that actually watch us evolve from rock, let's say up to President Bush, have never... Let's say I've never ever had to have an organic experience in order to oversee us. Say that they've never been in a body or in an organic experience.
That's right.
Okay,
they were just not human either.
Okay.
I've been reading a lot about Atlantis, and that was an ancient civilization, and I wondered if any of this information came from them down through the other civilizations.
It didn't come from Atlantis, it came from God.
Right.
And it was given in text form and oral form for centuries, and it's gradually now being released. But it came from God.
Right, of course. But did Atlantis have some part of this knowledge?
Yes.
Yeah, that was.
Yes.
I have 2 quick questions. The first, can you go from the 3rd dimension to the 5th without going through the 4th?
Yes.
Okay, good. And the second one, maybe you already explained this about the individuality of the soul. I'm a little confused. Does the spark have the potential of the allness all the way through the 1st dimension in it from the very beginning?
That's right. It does.
And if an animal is eaten by a human and then becomes a human, he must be
the opportunity to become a human. Yes.
But a different human than the one that eats him.
Yes.
Because his soul. So if there is in the 3rd dimension a male and a female, each have their own individual souls.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Do you think any of this is from Egypt with Akhenaten and I get that image of the sun and the
Ankh, the information seemingly
Well,
coming?
Egyptian priests knew a lot of this, yes. They did. Let's move on just a little bit, and we'll stop at about 10 minutes and take questions. We'll do that? Okay. The second dimension is called the spiritual underworld, and it's a dimension where after a person dies, they begin to take on a sort of a distorted understanding of the universe. Let's go into a little bit of detail. The second dimension is the place where ghosts, attaching spirits, and what we call lower class demons exist. Does everybody know what I mean by attaching spirits? Does anybody not know what I mean by that? Okay, an attaching spirit is a person who has passed and chooses to attach to a human being. Now, they might do that for any number of reasons. They might attach because they like that person. They might attach because that person drinks and they like to drink, or that person smokes and they like to smoke. Or they might attach that person out of some positive emotion. They might really love that person. Or they might attach because that person is somebody they hate and they want to kill them. There are specific places that attaching spirits like to attach. The most common place is the back of the head. The next most common place is the liver. The next most common place is anywhere along the GI system or the GI tract. And then the joints. When I look at a person, or when a person with the sight looks at attaching spirits, you can almost always find them in one of those areas. Also, I left out one, in the heart. Also, the second dimension is the origin of our various interpretations of what we call hell and heaven, or hell or purgatory. In the second dimension, you can find any of the heavens you want to look for. The Buddhist heaven, the Christian heaven, the Hindu heaven, all of them. That's not heaven. It looks like heaven, it feels like heaven, but it's not the same because it's in the second dimension. It's what our minds have conceived of as heaven or hell or whatever, and it's what we project into that dimension. It feels real because it's a dimension of thought. Harry Potter lives in the second dimension. And interestingly, if you talk to an author that really writes a lot, they will tell you that they can visit their characters, and their characters will tell them what's going on with the story. Like Dickens was very famous for talking to his characters. And he would get storylines or plots from his characters because they would say, oh, my character would never do that, or he's not doing this. And he would see his characters having dinner with them. And they would have long discussions about what's going on in their lives. When you learn how to astral travel and control it, one of the things you can do is you can visit Harry Potter's world. You can visit any of the worlds that you read about, and you can see they're real places. They're second-dimensional places, but they're real places. Third dimension, well, that's kind of where we live. But it's not the only place we live, but it's the main dimension that we focus on and that we're aware of. It's a dimension that's subject to change in a very rapid sense. Also is subject to fate, illness, and death. It's one of the few dimensions where a being can die very quickly. As I said, in the fifth dimension and above, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and above, beings don't die. In the fourth dimension, a being can die, but they're subject to much longer lifespan, tens of thousands of years versus in our dimension, a being, if it's lucky, might live to be 100 years old. In the third dimension, as we talked about earlier, the Z factor is prominent. It's also the dimension where we take in most of what goes on around us through our physical senses. We don't take in much information directly. The human mind is capable of taking in a great deal of information directly from the universe, except most of us have forgotten how to do that. We've forgotten that the universe transmits everything that needs to be known directly through the sun at all times. And that since the sun has been transmitting for millions of years, that information totally surrounds us. there are certain techniques that you can learn that you can use to absorb that information and sort of use it consciously for yourself. The fourth dimension is what we call a generated state of existence. In this dimension, something called intellect takes over. Now, I need to explain what that is. Let's start with this very simplistic interpretation of God. Okay? From that, we get four emanations, what we call consciousness, beingness, intellect, and form. Now, these four things are parts of what we call the higher mind. They are very real things. They're not just theosophical or theoretical constructs. We all have a part of us that instead of measuring its IQ in 2 or 3 digits, can be measured in multiple digits, 8, 9, 10 digits. For lack of a better term, for just the sake of our discussion, let's just call that the higher mind. Each of these parts of our higher mind breaks itself down when we come into the physical form. What do you think we call those? Chakras. Each chakra is responsible for creating a certain part of the physical body under the direction of our higher mind. So the light form or the light body doesn't have chakras. It has what we call force centers. Each of these force centers carries what we call impersonal energy or impersonal information. It comes directly from God. Impersonal because this energy has no ego. It's perfect energy. By the time it gets to the third dimension, it's broken down into a system of chakras. And our chakras are, for the most part, closed or almost closed. Because once our chakras start taking in energy from the higher dimensions, we start developing a connection with the higher mind. So, the first and second chakras have certain functions. They create the lower organs in the body, the sexual organs, the organs that regenerate us, etc., etc. The third and fourth chakras have also similar functions that we are all familiar with. Each of the chakras are the way that the body steps down, or that God steps down information into the physical form. A good example that one of my teachers told me about was that if you need to get electricity into your house, you don't plug your home stereo system into the main generator at Arizona Power Company. What you do is you have the electricity step down to transformers, etc., and gradually it gets into your house. And maybe a little transformer in front of your house that takes it to your fuse box that then distributes it to your house. The same thing happens in our physical bodies. Instead of getting energy directly from God, there's a series of step-down transformers or steps that take the energy and break it up so that it doesn't overwhelm us all at one time. We're not going to be able to get through all this. So let me just jump forward a couple of slides. because we're going to need to stop for questions too. Like I said, this is a 2-day seminar, and I don't have time to go through all of them. But I think this was important. At the moment of death in the physical body, the Z factor acts on the body and separates the soul and the body and forces the soul into the second dimension. Consciousness is then drawn into a 2-dimensional form, and what we call a ghost is created. A ghost is a copy of the physical body. There's a residual self-image that is formed. And this happens to 90% of people at the moment of death. The action of Z factor separates the body and the soul, forming a 2-dimensional copy of the body that we call a ghost. This is a good example, a good diagram about where we are in relation to the rest of the universe as far as the soul, as far as the dimensions. If you look at the sun here, the sun is not a third-dimensional entity, at least the sun that we're talking about. The sun derives most of its energy from the 5th dimension and emanates a lot of radiation and energy into the 3rd dimension. But the sun proper is a 5th-dimensional entity. We're way down here in the bad neighborhood part in the 3rd dimension. Where all the real action goes on in the universe is the 5th dimension and higher. From the 2nd dimension, a ghost may choose to become dormant. If a ghost chooses to become dormant, it will continue to be acted upon by the Z factor and be broken down into its constituent parts, those little light particles we talked about, and start the process of going through that whole cycle that we talked about earlier, viruses, plants, minerals, etc. A person can choose that. Also, a 2nd dimensional ghost form may choose to attach to a physical person, place, or thing. And this attachment can go on for hundreds or even thousands of years. A 2nd dimensional form may also choose to reincarnate into the 3rd dimension. That's what most people choose to do. It's not the only choice available, but that's what most people choose to do. When a human becomes more aware of their spiritual choices, they can take advantage of the various forms of X factor that we talked about earlier that are within this world, and that X factor can transform the human and the human soul into something that is no longer just mortal, that can become something that is a crystalline light structure that is immortal. Once that person dies, then that person takes advantage of the X factor, and the soul and the body, if the person goes through the entire process, the person becomes enlightened and the soul takes the body into the 5th dimension. Or if the person has only started the process, the soul itself enters the 5th dimension and is born as a theomorphic being, an unenlightened theomorphic being, and usually will have enlightened parents, and will finish the process, which is much easier in the 5th dimension. From the 5th dimension, the soul can then take advantage of the B factor, and from the B factor, it can move into the 9th dimension. Once the soul enters the 5th dimension, takes advantage of the B factor and goes into the 9th dimension, it cannot reincarnate. It will usually not also take a direct emanation. We'll stop right here and take some. We got about 50 more slides, but we won't be able to get through all of them.
I have a question.
I have about 60 or 70 books on Kosology written on this, but I can't give them out. But I can give some of the information out. And there's a book I'm writing called The Body of Light that summarizes all of this that'll come out in October. There really isn't a good book that has this information that I've seen, and believe me, I've looked. It's just not disseminated. Yes?
I'm wondering if, from your knowledge of psychiatry and this, someone with a multiple personality disorder has something from the 2nd dimension?
Usually attaching spirits.
Attaching spirits.
Yes.
Okay. Do you have any idea of how to work with them?
Yes.
Could you tell me?
I'll give you a case that I just did before I came here last week. I was working with a man who had a voice in his head that was telling him to cut his throat. And the voice had been there for a few weeks. And when he came in, I could see the attaching spirit, but the spirit wouldn't talk to me. And when it did talk to me, it would curse me out. And was very foul and violent with the cursing. So I did a couple of things, and the spirit calmed down. And I asked the spirit to talk to me. And the spirit was that of a slave who had been killed by its master. And I said, why did the master kill you? Because the slave said that the master was having sex with the slave's wife. And the slave was forced to watch. And so the slave got angry and started to try to beat the master and kill him. And the master had the slave shot. Well, the master had reincarnated as my patient. And the slave was still attached to him. And so I said a couple of words and showed the slave his family, his wife and his daughter, and I showed him that they were dead. And then a couple other things, and he agreed to leave the man, and he went into the light to be with his wife and his daughter. And the man's voice stopped, and he felt better. And he's been better since. And I've done hundreds of cases like that, and they don't usually come back.
Discuss this. What is the good? I once was told by somebody that my first chakra was wide open and it shouldn't be. And you made a comment about chakras being closed. So could you discuss this?
Well, chakras look a lot like balls of light, except they're slowly spinning. And in the average human, when I look at a human or an average person, the chakra is slowly spinning counterclockwise, very slowly. And there's a little center area in there that's dark that it's spinning around. And that's the connection with the impersonal mind. And that usually is very small. As a person's chakra becomes enlightened, as they begin to evolve, the chakra starts spinning clockwise. It reverses direction. And that ball, that little dark space in the center, becomes bright. So that instead of spinning very slowly, it starts spinning faster and faster, and it becomes lighter. It's no longer just a small, self-luminous ball of light. It becomes almost too bright to look at. But in the average human, it spins very slowly, and it's very low energy in comparison to what it will be after the person emanates more energy. So open and close is a relative term.
History. When did you first become involved? Was there a spiritual experience you had at a certain age?
When I was 6.
And when did you first come into contact with other dimensional beings?
When I was 6.
So it's been a long time.
Yeah. Thank you, folks, for coming, and thank you.